to our theme. I want you to read this very carefully, word for word. And I'm going to tell you where it's from and when it was said. In fact, let me read it, because when I read it, it just blows me away. So Netanyahu said, in fact, didn't say, he wrote in a book that hasn't been published. And the reason why it wasn't published, it was called the something Tiger. I can't remember, something Tiger. It was written in the early 2000s, but it wasn't published. But Haaretz got, again, must have been leaked somewhere. And this is one of the things that was leaked. And he wrote, corruption is like cancer that grows in the darkness. It distorts competition, it hurts citizens' morale and discourages them, because it signals that the path to material progress is not dependent on effort and talent, but on bribery. I mean, actually beggars belief. So I'm not going to pass judgment here, but I'm going to go through as in-depthly as I can. Now, I'm going to go over the hour. If you need to go, feel free, but, whatever. But it might just carry on a little bit more than I expected. Right, so here we go. And I've divided it into different sections, right? Early years, when he was studying, when he was a student, when he was a soldier, when he was a politician, when he was prime minister. The important thing here is that his father was born in Warsaw, while his mother was a Tsabarit, was born in Petach Tikva. Now, his father was a very important historian who Ben Gurion and his acolytes didn't like. And he was never given tenure at the Hebrew University, Benyamin Netanyahu. And that angered him and the family right the way through. And you'll see how it develops. They lived in the States 2 or 3 times. You'll see why. But initially, because Ben-Zion got a post at a university as a history professor, which he wasn't given at the Hebrew University. Okay? As a soldier, now remember, Netanyahu is a very, very important historical person in Israel, even though he's still alive now. And he's done incredible things. That's the tragedy of Netanyahu as an individual, where he ended up, where he could have ended up, and how history is going to judge him on the things that he didn't do, which they should be judging him on the things that he did do. We will come to that. He served for 5 years. Sayeret Matkal is the elite of the army units. Okay? It's equivalent to the Green Berets in the States and our SAS, whatever it is. For 5 years. He was in many secret incidents that took across the border. We don't know, and you won't know about, because they'll only be released in 50 years' time. And hopefully none of us will be out 50 years, but it doesn't matter. He was wounded in several times, including the hijacked Sabina. And remember the Sabina incident? If you haven't seen it, there's a movie on Netflix. It's horrendous, but watch it anyhow. He was wounded, but there was an incident there that's controversial. I don't want to go into it. He nearly blew the whole thing apart because he ran too early. I know that from someone who served with him, and that's not rumor. And they were lucky to get away with what they got away with, but that's another, it doesn't matter. He was a war hero. There's no doubt about it. And sadly, very few people know of it. Okay? The student. Now, also, he was very, very smart. He still is. He's a very, very smart person. He came top of his class in the initial thing. He studied at MIT. Also, he didn't know if he was going to end up staying in the States or not when he was this age. So, rumor has it, not rumor, the Haaretz found that he filled in the forms. He was going to change his name to Ben Nitai. Where Nitai looks like an American name, God alone. I mean, it doesn't matter. But he qualified from MIT. He was doing all kinds of really serious studying stuff. And then he had to return because his brother, Yoni, who led the Entebbe raid, was killed. Everybody knows that. What people aren't aware of necessarily is that Yoni was the apple of his father's eye. Yoni was the guy who was going to be the prime minister. In the same way as the Kennedys, Father Kennedy didn't think that John Jack was going to be president, but the eldest of the brothers who was killed. Almost the same parallel kind of story, right, with this kind of dynasty. But Yoni was the apple of his father's eye, and then no. So he graduated almost at the top of his class. He was headhunted. Now, here's very, very important. He was a colleague of Mitt Romney. Now, Mitt Romney is Republican right in his DNA, but Republican before Trump took over the Republican Party and turned into something else. He was very, very close to Mitt Romney, and you'll see how that develops as well as we go on. He also kept up his connections with Israeli politicians, including Moshe Ahrens. Now, Moshe Ahrens, that people might remember the name. Moshe Ahrens was the Minister of Defense in his time. He was also head of the Israel aircraft industry. He was also ambassador to the US. He was a very, very important politician and a very, very important right-hand man to Menachem Begin. And he was the mentor to Benjamin Netanyahu, and he stayed close to him. He becomes a politician in inverted commas, right? Because he didn't choose to become a politician. But because his English was so good, and he'd been in America for so long, he was a natural choice in the 80s, Menachem Begin's government, and then Shamir's government and so on, to be the representative in the US in some shape or form. So he was the ambassador to the UN, but, and here's my big but, he really was a believer in Menachem Schneerson. Menachem Schneerson was the Messiah. And there's still people who believe he's going to come back and be the Messiah, right? Huge, huge numbers of religious Haredi people believe Menachem Schneerson was the Messiah. And Netanyahu kept close to that way of thinking, for want of a better word. Also, and this is the real stain in my eyes, right? He became very close friends with Donald Trump's father and the family. And he visited, and I think he even stayed with the family for a while. When he used to go to New York or do things. So when Donald Trump became president and people were suddenly surprised that Netanyahu was so close to Trump, it wasn't a surprise to the people who knew the history and knew what was going on. But it had started off beforehand with his father. And people know the history of the Trump family, or you want to do it, you should go and read about Father Trump. Okay, so he then becomes a serious politician. He's ambassador to the US for 5 years. And it's not by chance that that's when America becomes the main supplier of arms to Israel.
1968.
After his 5 years, he's there, from 68 to 73. Okay?
Ian, do you mean 68? 86, 1986?
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry, that's an error. Yeah, the other way around. Thank you, John. That's I'm going to sack my editor because that should have been, anyway, sorry about that. Okay, so for 5 years, but that's when America becomes a main supplier of arms, even though it started beforehand, but he'd been the ambassador. He also was the ambassador to the UN. We'll come to that in a minute, which also runs parallel. He didn't have any real role in the Yom Kippur War, which is surprising, but doesn't matter. He was elected in the elections straight off the wall. They were quick elections that, people were still in Miluim. There was a mishmash of an election, but he was elected. We'll come to his main part of a politician later. But during the Gulf War, this is where Netanyahu really made his name. Remember, during the Gulf War, the Americans and the American coalition were really perturbed how Israel was going to retaliate when rockets, and 2 rockets hit Haifa, by the way, in case people have forgotten. People were wearing gas masks, in case you've forgotten. Every single citizen in Israel had to have a gas mask. Houses and apartments had to have a secure room, they called it. And people literally sealed, because in those days they hadn't built these extra safe, secure rooms. So people were sealing bathrooms with tape because there was a huge fear that Saddam Hussein would use poison gas. He'd used it against the Iranians. He used it against his own people. He did it against Israel with the ability and the rockets to do it. This wasn't make-up stuff. This was a real threat. But the coalition, the American coalition, was very concerned that Israel would retaliate and react, and this would blow up into a full-scale Middle East conflict, which they didn't want to happen. They wanted to be contained to Iraq and just the Gulf, and remember there were Gulf states that were in the coalition as well. So he was the focus of what Israel was doing and saying, and he was brilliant, by the way, because he's a brilliant speaker, and he knows how to work the media. He knows what television is about, and that's why he successfully over and over defeated labor leaders, because they didn't know how to deal with the media, with television, like Netanyahu did. He's elected leader of the Likud in 1993. Now, this is where the real stuff really starts. I mentioned this thing about in 1996, they put out evidence that he tried to change his name. Made no difference, people didn't care, right? The same way they don't care now of the charges against him, and even more so now that this NSO stuff has come out. You can imagine how people are going to react to, okay, so he took some money and some champagne and Sarah got gifts from Packer. So what? Okay. Now, in 1996, soon after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and we've been through that, and we remember, I hope, the rally in Jerusalem a week before Rabin was assassinated, and Netanyahu on the balcony, while the placards that we saw last week, and pictures of Rabin dressed as Arafat and so on, right? Anyhow, Peres calls a quick election. But in the mean, what had happened during the process, Israel had changed the voting system, and they changed it once and reverted straight back. How did they change it? You had 2 votes, one for a party for the Knesset and another vote directly for prime minister. It was crazy. So what happened is that Peres's party, Labour, got a majority, but Netanyahu got the votes to be prime minister, which was, obviously didn't work. So they tried to form a coalition, but what happened was that Netanyahu outmaneuvered Peres very quickly, and he became the youngest. I forget how old he was, doesn't matter. I think he was in his 40s. the youngest and the first prime minister to be born in Israel. Remember, Rabin and all the other guys were born in Palestine. He was born in the state of Israel. Okay? So he forms a coalition government with the usual, mob, to put it mildly, Shas, UTJ, Litzman, and the whole 9 yards. Now, this is the first time that there's a government that is fundamentally opposed to the Oslo Accords. Now, remember what the Oslo Accords were. And if you haven't, there's a great, I think it's Netflix, it probably is Netflix, series called The Girl from Oslo. It's hard to watch. It's not, I really encourage people to watch it, because there you really understand how they were trying to make an agreement with the Palestinians. That almost happened, by the way, but it didn't, because of the bombs and the suicide bombers in Jerusalem and all kinds of things. But Netanyahu, was fundamentally opposed to Oslo, which became very, very important as we go on. In 1996, Ehud Olmert was the mayor of Jerusalem. He and Netanyahu, with all the archaeological stuff that was going on, opened up another exit under the Kotel, or nearby the Kotel, coming out in the Arab Quarter, that blew everything. It was as controversial and as incendiary as Arik Sharon going to the Kotel on Shavuot when he did, and set off the second Intifada. So this led to riots all over the place. Anyway, very important again, because it shows that Netanyahu is not afraid, or wasn't afraid then, even now, not afraid to make controversial and incendiary acts because he believes in his ideology. Now, I can fault him for all kinds of things, but one thing that I know for sure, that Netanyahu is one of the shrewdest, probably the shrewdest politician that Israel has ever seen, and it probably will ever see. And also the most committed to the right-wing ideology of Eretz Yisrael Shlema, of Yehuda v'Shomron, of annexing. He just doesn't do it now because he's smart enough to understand what would happen worldwide and America and so on. Okay, he meets Arafat in 1996, and then he comes up with the 3 no's, the famous 3 no's of Netanyahu. Now remember the 3 no's way back after the 6-Day War that the Arabs had come out with. Netanyahu now had 3 no's of his own. There was going to be no withdrawal from the Golan. There are no discussions on Jerusalem ever. Not going to talk about Jerusalem being also the Arab capital of Palestine, East Jerusalem. Not going to talk about it. Jerusalem is not on the table for discussion. And the third thing is there's no preconditions to discussions, because he knew that no way in a million years would Arafat or the Palestinians accept any of that. Okay? Under his watch, there is the failed assassination of Khalid Mashal in Jordan, in Amman. If you remember, they put poison in his ear. They got caught. They had to fly the head of the Shin Bet with a vial of whatever it was to undo the poison. Relations with Jordan were very, very close at the time. And they said, you're meeting with us. I think one of the heads of the Mossad at the time was in Amman meeting with his opposite number while this was going on. They said, you guys are crazy. On our own soil, you try and kill the Hamas leader. And then everything went downhill as far as Jordan was concerned, really downhill. What he then did, internally in his first term, economically changed the whole focus of Israeli economics. From a socialistic socialism kind of helping state to a capitalist focused, very little regulation. Israelis for the first time could hold foreign accounts. Remember, Yitzhak Rabin had to resign because his wife had a $200 account in the States when they were there. So economically, also under his watch, Israel changes and becomes a powerhouse. There's no doubt that what he did economically saved Israel from going down a plug hole, economically. No doubt. And again, is he going to be remembered for that, or is he going to be remembered for, the nonsense corruption scandal? So the first scandals, the first set of scandals come in 1997. And the police recommended that he actually be charged. But remember how Israeli politics work. The Attorney General is appointed by the Prime Minister. Similar to the States, where the President appoints the Attorney General. So he's one of your henchmen. They changed the system up now where you saw there 5 people on a committee, you need 4 out of 5 to accept the recommendations. It's much more complicated than it was in 25 years ago, 1997. And he was accused of influence peddling, very seriously. Then there were scandals of his marriage. Remember, Netanyahu's been married 3 times. Sarah is his 3rd wife. And there were scandals of all kinds of things. And they didn't have Pegasus in those days, by the way. Okay. Anyway, the Attorney General, surprisingly, believe it or not, his henchman doesn't prosecute. Guess why? But this had an impact on Israeli society. And Ehud Barak defeats him in the election, and Netanyahu literally retires from politics, or says he's had enough, he's not going to do it. All things go on, I'm not going to go, I haven't got time for it. But Arik Sharon we'll see next week, because he's our surprise. Oh, by the way, we didn't know, Arik Sharon is our surprise prime minister that nobody got next week. He becomes and why he becomes prime minister, all kinds of reasons, doesn't matter. But he appoints Netanyahu finance minister. So in addition to all the stuff that he'd done when he was prime minister, he now can strengthen as finance minister. His second term then takes over and he becomes prime minister, begins in 2009. Now remember, he's been prime minister. Oh, the name of the book, by the way, was Israeli Leopard. That's what it was called. Netanyahu was the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. And he will be, because no one's going to serve as long as it. 15 years, all in all. His first, second, third, fourth, fifth, 5 terms he served. Ben Gurion was only prime minister for 13 years. Yeah, and Netanyahu, by the way, might not be over yet with the way things are going. Who knows? Barack Obama is elected president. Now, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, as we've seen what happened during that 8 years of presidency, did not like each other, to put it mildly. And in Sylvia's little black book, you'll see I've always said personal chemistry between leaders is a very, very important requisite to what happens in relations between countries. And that's why when Naftali Bennett went to meet American president, they went off into a side room, him and Biden. They were supposed to meet for half an hour. They met for an hour and a half or something. And everyone was so happy and happy clappy because the personal chemistry worked. Obama and Netanyahu hated one another. There's another way to describe it. And that comes out in the politics. Remember when Netanyahu went straight to Congress and made his speech to Congress literally behind Obama's back. And that was the last nail in the coffin as far as their relations were concerned. Okay? He demanded that the Palestinians give up the right to return to Palestine. Now remember, this is going to be, by the way, and it's going to be right the way through, the crux of why peace is so unattainable in this generation, is because the Palestinians still believe, and I said it last week, and I say it every week, believe that the refugees who still hold the key in their pockets and pass to their grandchildren should be able to go back to where they lived in 1948. Israel can never accept that, ever. UNRWA still keeps Palestinian refugees in refugee camps. They tried to set up talks, which was never, ever going to happen. But in the meanwhile, in 2011, I mentioned this beforehand, in the social power of the society, there were these huge protests, and they camped in the boulevards in Tel Aviv. I remember it very, very well. I said so beforehand. The pressure was huge. But when it came to vote, in the polls before the election in 2013, now we're coming to the elections that we got caught up in soon, but we need to look at this one first. They really got it wrong. And since then, the polls have got it right because they realized that they needed to start doing their homework properly. But they got fewer seats than they expected because they ran with Lieberman's party. Remember, Lieberman comes from Israel Beiteinu, and his base never changes. His is the Russian base, which will never change. So he is the leader of the largest faction. Now remember, we're now talking, I'll show you in a minute a graph of the slides. A faction as opposed to a party is very, very different news, because it means you have to start compromising on ideological and manifesto issues like this government's having to do. Anyhow, very quickly, remember the 3 Israelis are kidnapped, and then Operation Protective Edge begins and, of course, changes the whole thing. That's the first time Israel goes into Gaza, by the way, Protective Edge and the whole thing. Relations with the USA have hit rock bottom. He then fires Yair Lapid, who was the Minister of Finance, who he then says was the worst Minister of Finance he's ever seen in the latest elections, and Tzipi Livni, who was, I think she was Justice Minister, that's right. And new elections are called for 2015. Okay? He forms a coalition with Moshe Kahlon, if the name rings a bell, who was the leader of the Kulanu party. He had brought mobile phones and cheap contracts to Israel. That was his claim to fame. And he had got involved in this whole social upheaval. Okay? The criticism of John Kerry is very important here. Remember, John Kerry was the Secretary of State. He was in Israel, and while he was in Israel, as a slap in the face, the Israelis announced new buildings that were going to be built, new apartments, I think it was 3,500 new apartments in the West Bank, while Kerry was there. Americans you can imagine, right? And that didn't go down well. Then we go on. He's the first Prime Minister of Australia, but 2018, he shows the world what Israel had taken out of Iran. And if you watch this documentary, by the way, it focuses a lot on that. The next big issue is the nation-state law. I don't want to go into detail of it because I'm going to go into detail of it when we talk to the leader of the Ethiopian community on the 22nd. We're going to spend a lot of time on that. It's about discrimination and all this stuff. Anyway, but the nation-state law, the fundamental issue there is that Jews have all the access and all the rights to a Jewish homeland. And Hebrew is the official language of the country. Arabic has got special status. Whereas before, the unwritten law was there were two official languages in Israel, Hebrew and Arabic. One of the worrying statements that were made by many people was that Arab communities that fight with Israelis, that are Gashashim, or the what is a Gashash? A guy goes in front of the thing and looks for tracks, a tracker, right? We can fight and die with you, but we can't buy houses and live in the same suburbs as you. And Afula, the city that my kibbutz was nearby, stopped Arabs buying houses in, or apartments, on house apartments in suburbs in Afula. Hugely problematic. And that, by the way, is in Israel, and that's where this Amnesty International apartheid issue becomes very real. Okay, so this right-wing agenda starts going through there, and you know what? I am going to go just a little bit more, and then I'm going to stop. And I'm going to start next week by carrying on with this, because I don't want to miss out on what's happening here. But what I do want to show you is, let me get there, this, right? This was the election result of the 2020 March election. Okay? The third election, not the last one, the third election. This is where Netanyahu was sitting in March 2020. Now look at those numbers for a minute. Because if you take out the joint Arab list, because it's now split into Ram, there are only two parties that get over double figures. The Blue-White Party of Gantz, which now just fell apart, and Yesh Atid got more than that. But basically, nothing has changed. And that's where Netanyahu's power always was. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here at the end of the fourth term. And next week, we'll begin with the fifth term and where we are now.